Back in Power BI, and in today's video, we're going to show you how to make a date table using Dax. Now, there's different ways you can make a calendar table. Some people call it a date table, but we're going to show you one way that if you have a format that you want to use in multiple files, this formula for Dax can be easily copied and then pasted as a new date table in multiple files. So we're going to show you how to format the different rows, select some of the different items you're going to want in your Dax table, and then show you some of the benefits of using these variables and then writing out your formatting. And then once you have this Dax formula, you can connect it to your data, and then you can have a date table, and you can also have a dimension table. So we're going to show you how to create a date table using a Dax formula. Let's go to Power BI. Back in Power BI, this time around, we're going to continue to learn Dax. And today, in this video, we are going to show you how to make a simple date table using variables, add columns, a filter function, and the calendar auto function. There are different ways to make a complete date calendar, and we do have videos up on how to make it with Dax, and you can also make a calendar table with Power Query, and I have a video on the channel. But today, if you have a new project and sometimes you want to use the same simple date table across multiple files, this is a quick way, and then you can copy and paste the code into a new file and start creating a date table. We're going to show you how to do that. The first thing we're going to do is open up Power BI, and we are going to take data from an Excel workbook. We're going to put a link to the workbook in the description below, so you can download it from Maven Playgrounds. They have a bunch of data sets, and the data set is going to be a coffee data set. So we're going to choose Get Data from Excel Shop Sales. And when you select this, you're going to open this file. This is going to connect it to the worksheet. And first thing we're going to do is you'll notice you've got a transactions table. And we're going to select the transactions table. And now it's going to do a preview. The preview has not actually been loaded into Power BI yet. This is just a preview to make sure that you have the correct data. There's two options you can use from the preview. You can either do a load function. That is going to be very rare. Normally, you're going to want to have data transformations, clean up your data. So you are going to select transform data. And what this is going to do is open up the Power Query window. The Power Query window is where you make all of your transformations, and we do have videos on how to start learning Power Query that other videos will focus in on that. So when you open up Power Query, you have an untitled file, and your name of your query should always reflect the name of the data. So we're going to change this to coffee sales. And currently, all it's done for the applied steps is you have your source, then it promoted the headers, and it changed the data types. You always want to look at your data types. The transaction date, which is going to be the key for the data table, that is a date table, and the transaction time is a date and time column. The rest of these are all set to go. There's no further changes besides renaming the file. Next, we're going to close and apply. Now, this is when your data actually gets loaded into the table. So it's loading the data to the model. Currently, we are going to have one table in this model before we create the date table. The date table is what we're going to use to build a relationship between the date column in the coffee sales table and to the date table. So currently in our relationship view, we have one table called coffee sales. If we go to the report view and select modeling, we're going to create a new table. And the new table, normally when you use a calendar table, you want to either name it calendar or date. So in this example, we're going to use date. And we're going to start off with a variable, and the variable is going to be named min year. And min year is going to be equal to the year function. And from the year, we're going to choose the min, which returns the year of a date as a 4-digit integer. So that is going to be the minimum. And since we only have one table, we're going to select and use our IntelliSense, and we want to grab data from the transaction date. That has all of the dates that the coffee was sold. Then we're going to close it out with 2 parentheses. The next variable is going to be the max year. And this is going to be calculated with that year function again. And the formula to make this a little bit bigger for you is the maximum year is going to be the year. Then we're going to use the max. And then we're going to use the coffee. And we're going to use the transaction date. So then we're going to close this out with 2 right parentheses. So to make this even bigger, we're now going to bring in the return function. Whenever you use a variable, you need to have the return. Now we're going to use a function called add columns. And what add columns does is, if you look at your IntelliSense, it returns a table with new columns specified by the Dax expression. So we're going to create our own columns. We're going to do this by using a filter function. And the filter is going to come from the new table using, now that we have our filter function, we need to look for the what's called the calendar auto. And the calendar auto function, this is what is going to drive the columns that we create with the add columns. So the calendar auto now is going to ask for the and then we're going to bring in the year, the date, close that out, and it's got to be greater than or equal to the variable which we created as the min year. That is that little x function. Then we're going to bring in the year function, and we're going to use the date, close that out, and it's got to be less than or equal to the max year, which we set up as one of our variables. So now we're going to close that out. Next, we're going to close out the filter function. Now we start to add our columns. The first column is going to be the calendar year. And remember, whatever you put in parentheses will be the name of the column. And this is going to be calculated as calendar year space quotation marks. Then we're going to bring in the and function and the year. And this is going to concatenate the date to that year. So we're going to close that out. The second column we're going to bring in is the month name. And the month name is going to be formatted. If you're familiar with Excel, you can format using the date function. So the month name, then we're going to format. Now we're going to bring in the date function. And with that date function, we're going to use 4 M's, which will be lowercase. If we put capital M's, then it would be uppercase. So now we have the month name. Next, we're going to add the month number. And the month number is 1 through 12. And we're going to use the month function to get the number 1 through 12. And that's going to be the date function. Close that out. And the final one we're going to bring in is we need to add another line, and then we're going to bring in the weekday. And this is going to be calculated as the weekday is going to be a function that uses the format And the format is going to be the date column. Then we're going to format it as quotation marks DDDD. That'll give you the long short date. If you went DDD, then it would be Friday as 3 letters, FRI, versus Friday as 7 letters. So now all we need to do is close out that, and then we're going to close out the add columns. So the function looks like this. You've got your variable for the min year, your variable for the max year. Then we're going to return the add columns function. It's going to be the filter, the calendar auto, and then we're going to create our column. So just by hitting enter, that is going to create our date table. Now, if you notice on the right-hand side, we have a coffee sales table and we have a date table. Next, we can go to the relationship function and we can see that we have coffee sales. So we're going to make date on top, which is going to be the lookup table. And then we're going to use the transaction date as the connector to the date table. And this is going to create a one-to-many relationship. Before we do that, we want to go back to the date table and we want to take this table that we just created and make that a date table. So if we mark this as a date table, now you see we've got the calendar year column that we created, the month name column we created, the month number, and the weekday. So we're going to select the date, which is unique, and you want to make sure it says validated successfully. And when you mark this as a date table, that's when you can start to use some of the time intelligence functions when you're writing DAX. So now we're going to create that as a date table, go back to the relationship, and we're going to use date. You see that little calendar icon means that it's a date table. So we can bring the date table all the way down to the transaction date, and that's going to create the relationship, a one-to-many relationship. So now we have a date table, we have a fact table, which is the coffee sales, and the date table contains our columns that we created. Now, if we wanted to create more columns, what you can do now, if you go back to this date table, that is an Excel formula. And I'm going to make this bigger so you can see. Now you could copy this, or you can add more things to this table. And if you just copy this table and paste it in a new Power BI file, you would only need to change out the table that in this file, we're using coffee sales, but you would just change out coffee sales and the column. So you'd have 2 things to change there. And then that's the only 2 columns and table you would have to change out to use in your next file. So that is looking at making a simple date table that you could reuse this DAX code. Remember, you could use a calendar function, but with that, if we were to add more data to that Excel table and connect to it, when you use the calendar function, you are hard coding those dates in. You're hard coding the start date and the end date. And then if you use the calendar auto function, if you have multiple columns with different dates in them, it'll take all of the different dates. So if you had a birth date, or if you had a transaction date, or a year built, or purchase date, all of those would get combined, and that would be a large date table. That is a look at how to build a simple date table using DAX in Power BI.